Welcome to Hatcher History, the past unlocked, telling the story of the people, places, and decisions that changed everything. In the early evening of the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died of a brain hemorrhage at Osborne House, her country retreat on the Isle of Wight. The Queen was related to nearly all of the royal families of Europe, and so consequently many of their number came to London to pay their last respects. After a funeral that incorporated much of the pomp and splendour that late Victorians had come to expect from large state and imperial occasions, her body was laid to rest next to that of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. This was at the royal mausoleum that she had built for him in the grounds of Frogmore House at Windsor 40 years before. In retrospect, this was to be one of the last great meetings of the ancient dynasties of Europe. The old world of the 19th century and before was crumbling away, and within a generation, most of the monarchs who followed Queen Victoria's cortege on horseback through the streets of London and then Windsor had been forced from their thrones. The world that the Queen departed in 1901 was very different from the one in which she had been crowned in 1837. Perhaps this was most obviously shown by the massive urban and industrial transformations that had altered the world so markedly over the intervening 64 years. This had begun earlier with the Industrial Revolution that had made Britain a world leader, the first industrial nation, the workshop of the world. Based on cotton, coal, and iron, this had seen the construction of great factories powered by steam. Cities such as Liverpool and Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Belfast all grew enormously, a process boosted enormously in the first decade of the new Queen's reign as a result of the great railway boom. Queen Victoria had ruled Britain and its ever-expanding empire for over 6 decades, and she had seen her country come to dominate the world in a way that no other nation had ever done before. As a result, through trade, industry, and military conquest, the British under Victoria had amassed an empire upon which the sun never set, with the old Queen, when she was laid to rest in 1901, ruling over a quarter of the world's population. London was at the centre of this, with 40% of world trade passing through its docks, and with 50% of world trade being transported on British ships, with Britain becoming the world's banker, shipper, insurer, and investor. But Queen Victoria did not only lend her name to the age of British domination over which she had presided, she also personified the old order that was so well represented at her funeral. All this had made Britain, for a century or more, by far and away the world's greatest commercial power. But as the old century drew to a close, this was beginning to change. Britain remained dominant, but the USA, France, and particularly Germany, as well as other emerging nations in the Far East such as Japan, were all beginning to challenge this British industrial, colonial, and commercial preeminence. Her death then, perhaps more than any other event at the turn of the century, symbolized the end of the old and the beginning of the new. As this new world order began to emerge in the early years of the new century, technological improvements spawned a myriad of new industries and new products. Perhaps the most important of these was the motor car, the automobile, the first of which had been built in Germany by Carl Benz in 1885. This was to have the most enormous impact and was to revolutionize both transport and warfare. Among the early beneficiaries of this new boom were the huge oil companies that grew massively in the early years of the century, especially in California and Texas, where much of the world's oil came from prior to the 1930s. The world was also changed beyond recognition by the development of electricity. The electrical and car industries were in their infancy in 1900. Yet these industries and many others were soon to reshape everyday life, industry, and warfare in ways unimaginable just a few decades earlier. Huge changes had also been made in photography and cinema since the first photos had been taken in the 1830s and the first moving pictures had been shown at a theatre in Paris in 1895. In 1900, photography was made accessible to the masses when Kodak brought out the box Brownie, the world's first handheld camera. In 1903, the first ever narrative film, the 12-minute long The Great Train Robbery, was filmed at Edison Studios in New York. Although the center of this new industry was soon to find a new home on the other side of the country, in the Los Angeles suburb of Hollywood. A little later, Charlie Chaplin arrived there in search of fame and fortune, created the Tramp, and became the world's first millionaire film star. At the same time, football, or soccer, one of the most important social developments of the century, was beginning to draw huge crowds. Soon sport and television, which developed in the 1920s out of cinema, was to unite. And by the end of the century, 80 years later, more than half the world's population were tuning in to watch events such as the Football World Cup and the Olympic Games. These events over time were to generate huge profits in revenue for the advertising industry, which in 1900 was also in its infancy. In the late 19th century, huge strides had also been made in medicine after the Frenchman Louis Pasteur had established the link between germs and disease in the 1860s. This had led to important developments in the treatment and prevention of killer diseases, and by 1900, vaccines had been found for illnesses such as rabies and diphtheria. In 1905, Pasteur's great German rival, Robert Koch, who in the 1870s had proved the link between germs and disease in humans, received the Nobel Prize for his research into a cure for tuberculosis. At the beginning of the century, this was still the world's greatest killer, as it had been since it had first affected human populations at the end of the Neolithic period. This was the new Stone Age, 10,000 years ago, at the beginning of settled human civilization, when humans began first farming domesticated animals, with these first farmers catching the disease from cattle. Crucial advances had also been made in surgery, where antiseptic and then aseptic conditions were increasingly adopted. As the new century got underway, governments in many countries were also adopting vaccination programs, although it was still to be another 40 years until an effective and widespread answer to combating infection was developed in the form of penicillin. Man's ability to communicate had also been revolutionized in the last years of the 19th century, with the world technologically becoming a much smaller place. The telegraph had dated from the 1830s and the telephone from the 1870s, and both were important developments of the 19th century. These led to work on radio communication by men such as Marconi, who successfully sent a radio signal across the English Channel in 1899. 2 years later, He bettered this when he managed to communicate with America thousands of miles away across the Atlantic from his radio station in the west of Ireland. Coming at a time of European colonial domination, these improvements in communications gave leaders in Europe a much more direct control over colonial affairs. But perhaps the event that most strikingly symbolized the progress that the new century promised was the first flight made by the Wright brothers. This took place above the sand dunes of the small coastal town of Kitty Hawk on the Atlantic coast of North Carolina on the 17th of December 1903. Their quest had begun 8 years earlier in 1896 in their bicycle repair shop in Ohio, and before their ultimate success, they had made over 700 trial flights in handmade gliders. The first flight was piloted by Orville Wright, who flew a distance of only 197 feet, staying in the air for just 12 seconds. Later in the day, his brother Wilbur took control of the Wright Flyer and flew a distance of 850 feet, remaining airborne for 59 seconds. In 1909, the English Channel was crossed for the first time by Louis Blériot, the French aviator, and within 5 years, aircraft development had advanced so quickly that aerial warfare could be waged above the trenches of World War I. After the brothers had taken man to the air in this first flight of fancy in 1903, it was to be only 58 years before Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space in April 1961, and only 66 before Neil Armstrong landed on the moon in the summer of 1969. Thanks so much for watching our video today. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did so, please think about subscribing or giving us a thumbs up. Please follow Hatcher History on Instagram or at .shop.